Hey everybody, Quantum back here again, and this is my third time recording or attempting to record this video because I find myself rambling a little too much on this Ruby Sapphire deck. But I do want to cover this because I think it is very important, as many people are saying that this is the best deck of the format. It obviously took some of the bigger tournaments over the release weekend, and it does seem like it's a pretty dominant deck. It got some really nice upgrades in Ursula's Return. I want to cover why I think this is not the best deck and why we may see this fall out of the meta a little bit. I think it's still a very strong deck, don't get me wrong, but when you're aiming to play this as your primary deck, I just think you want to consider a few issues. For me personally, while I am a control player at heart, and this is a control deck, this deck just doesn't check the boxes that I look for in a control deck, because while it works, and when it does work, it just seems like the best deck ever, and I will acknowledge that. When it loses, you're in a situation where you just have no options and you just feel helpless, right? And you lose really badly. And for me, I just prefer a deck that's a little bit more balanced and well-rounded. And again, you may argue that maybe I'm not playing the deck correctly, or I guess you could say maybe I don't know what I'm talking about because I'm not the highest level player. I'm not sitting here grinding out endless matches. But I just want to give you my perspective on it, and maybe it'll help shed some light if you're struggling with this deck and or whether or not this might be the deck for you to try or not. So to start off, we can cover why this deck would be good to play, and one of the main reasons is the upgrades that it got from Ursula's Return are very accessible, and that's probably why it saw success in, or not, I don't say probably, but one of the main reasons why it could have seen success in in-person tournaments, because the Scuttles and the Sisus are just uncommons, very cheap to upgrade. The only thing that's really going to cost you anything are these legendary Sisu empowered siblings, and if you got these early, they were like $20 before they spiked up in price. I don't think they're worth the price that they're at right now, by the way, but we'll wait and see. But the reason that this combination works is because this Sisu can end up banishing higher strength characters if you use something like Ice Block to reduce the strength of a character, and then you play your Sisu to out it. So for example, the new Pegasus is a 3/3 body, the one that shifts, and if you use Ice Block on it, it makes it a 2/3 body. Then if you drop the Sisu, it'll out the Pegasus. So it's a nice way to out evasive characters, which are usually lower strength. You just peg them down a little bit if needed on the Ice Block, and then the Sisu acts as a sweeper, similar to what Be Prepared did prior to the Sisu coming out. So aside from the Sisu, the rest of the deck in terms of upgrades are fairly accessible. The other things you add are like Brawls, again very cheap, just a common, and Ice Blocks, again just a common. Everything else is from prior sets, and the deck is just really easy to upgrade. So if you had the core of this deck before, it's very easy to adapt in person for Ursula's Returns meta, at least right now. Another nice thing with this deck is it is still very, very powerful. The Madame Medusa, I think, is better than ever before. There are a lot of low-strength characters that are being played in the format, with Amber Ruby, I think, becoming a really good deck now. Even the non-Mufasa versions, which maybe I'll cover later. Emerald being the best color in the game at this point. Almost everything in Emerald falls to Madame Medusa, especially the Diablos and the Ursula Deceiver of Alls, right? So Madame Medusa is just a very, very good card, and it continues to be just a powerhouse in the format. So these are some of the real advantages you get with this deck. Now, why it may not be the deck for me and why I don't particularly like it, and I don't know if I'll be able to fit some gameplay into this video or if I'll make it in a separate video, but you inherently have some problems with this deck that persist still, the same problems you had prior to Ursula's Return. And one of the main ones is your card draw engine is basically only reliant on Hiram still. Yes, you do have cards like Popsicle to draw, you have scrying cards like How Far I'll Go potentially, and I may cut these from the deck. Develop Your Brains, Tamatoa on the top end to recycle your Popsicles to draw cards, and you're like, well, I'm scrying so much, I'll probably see multiple Hirams, I'm aggressively mulliganing for a Hiram, that kind of thing. And while all that is great, there's been situations where you may play your Hiram, you pop an item, you draw your 2, and then your opponent immediately outs the Hiram, right? Or you quest with it, or you don't have an item, and whatever it might be, your Hiram's exerted, it gets Mauied on the opposing end, or it gets removed somehow. It is susceptible to Sisu Daring Visitor, to the Madame Medusas, to the big Sisus on opposing Ruby sides. Like, people know to aggressively look at ways of outing this card, right? Because it is one of the only ways that Ruby Sapphire has to draw cards, unfortunately. So with that in mind, you need to see Hiram. The other thing that kind of is anti-synergistic with this deck is the same thing that you run into with Amber Steel Song when it played flutes, in that when you played Aerial, if you ended up scrying 4 and you see like 1 or 2 flutes and you're like, oh shoot, there go 2 of my flutes at the bottom of the deck. If you play a Scuttle and you scry 4 for an item, which is a thing that you absolutely need to do, right? Because you need to see Fishbone Quill. Aggressively mulliganing for Hiram and Fishbone Quill is, is something that you probably have to do, or the Scuttle. It's really, I guess, matchup dependent, but this is why the deck can be a little complicated to play, and making some decisions on the mulligan can be very important on what you want to go for. But if you scuttle away a Hiram, or you're forced to ink a Hiram or ink a Fishbone Quill, I mean, hopefully you never are in a situation where you have to ink a Fishbone Quill if you don't already have one in play. But like, that is just another thing that can add to some issues with the deck. The fact that you play so many uninkables, if you're forced to ink a Hiram, you scuttle away a Hiram, like, you're just like, well, I have to hope to draw one of the 2 remaining ones that are in the deck somewhere. You're just like, what am I doing now? Like, I'm going to run out of gas really fast, right? And you play so much top end in terms of uninkables, these are just going to be dead cards in your hand until they come online. Again, that being said, once they come online, they're very strong. And one of the benefits is this Sisu does shift onto the smaller Sisu, which can be really, really strong, especially, wiping out a board early. And if you do get this off, it can be a game-winning play. Like, it's sometimes all you need in order to swing the match back into your favor. The issue is, if your opponent has aggroed you enough, they just might not need that much to close out the game. Now, again, this deck is still very strong, because on the top end, you're just going to be removing everything most likely, but you probably will run out of gas at some point. And you got to remember, these other decks have also improved in terms of their card draw engines. Like, the Diablo in and of itself is a huge problem. If you Hiram quest and banish an item, or Hiram, play the Hiram, banish an item, draw 2, while that Diablo is exerted, you're giving them a draw 2 as well, right? So you have to be aware of that stuff as in the meta right now, as I think Emerald is the best color. The other thing is you need to see Fishbone Quill. So not only do you need to see a Hiram, you need to see Fishbone Quill. And a deck that is built around seeing 2 cards out of, you play 4 ofs in the deck, out of a whole 60 card deck, or even more in this case, because I'm on 62. But again, I've updated this deck since then, and maybe we'll take a look at that a little bit later in the gameplay videos. But if you don't see both of these cards, like, you're really, really behind. Now, that being said, if you do see the Fishbone Quill, I think this is probably the more important card, because you need to be able to ink every turn. And even if you don't have a card to play for ink during that turn, if you at least have the Fishbone Quill and you can ink something like your Sisu or your Madame Medusa when you're on like 3, 4, 5 ink, this helps you get to where you need to be in order to start playing your big threats, so that they're not bricks, dead cards in your hand. Inking away a Sisu when it's not useful in the situation or matchup, inking away a 1 jump ahead where you'd rather ink this than play it if it costs you tempo, right? If it costs you 2 ink to ink for turn because you don't have any other inkables and you're just forced to play the 1 jump, like that, that's not great. Like, I'd rather ink something than have to pay 2 ink in order to play a 1 jump to get my ink for the turn, right? So Fishbone enabling your hand to be inkable is huge for this deck. It kind of what the Inkcaster does now for Emerald too, right? Emerald has a lot of powerful cards, but they're uninkable, which makes them unplayable to a certain degree. But now with the Inkcaster, we might see that develop into something in the meta as well. And then that leads to the third problem. So you need to see Hiram, you need to see Fishbone, because you're stuck with these dead cards in hand otherwise. And then the third problem is, out of your inkables, out of these 39 inkables that you're playing in this deck, and again, I probably edited this deck to go down to 18 on inkables, but I don't want to ink half of my uninkables sometimes. The cards that you probably don't mind inking are, depending on the situation, the Scuttle, the Grammatalus, Maui's, Maleficents, Tamatoas, and I guess Develop Your Brains. You don't want to ink Fishbone unless you see multiples. You don't probably ever want to ink a Popsicle unless you have to. You can ink the Shield, but it's just another item for Hiram. These are all uninkable. You probably don't want to ink Brawls, again, matchup dependent, but this card is literally your savior in most matchups, especially the Emerald matchups, when you absolutely need to slow them down. And Develop Your Brains, cost 1, like, you're probably playing this, not inking it, right? I mean, in certain situations you have to ink it. So your inking decisions can be very complicated in this deck. When do I know to play my Develop versus when to ink it? When do I know that I have to ink my Popsicle or play it, right? Like, it's kind of hit or miss with that. So out of these inkables, like, I never want to ink a Hiram, right? If this is my only inkable in hand, though, because I aggressively mulligan and I got my Hiram, I'm like, great, that's perfect. But the rest of my hand is just like uninkables, and I'm like, if I don't ink the Hiram, I'm not progressing my ink for the turn. And if you've seen people play these decks, I'm pretty sure there's been many situations where they're just like, I need to draw the inkable so I can play this Hiram next turn, and they don't draw, and they're just like, well, I'm inking the Hiram. And then they draw their Fishbone Quill later on, and then it's just like, I don't have the Hiram, So I'm inking from my hand, but then I can't replenish my hand because I've inked my Hiram, or I've scuttled away a Hiram. And so there's just like, it's just a weird combination of things that make this deck, I don't know, it just feels like unless you get the really nice setup, it just feels really underwhelming. And again, maybe this deck just requires that big brain to play, and maybe I'm just not there. But for me, in testing, the deck is still very strong, and we're going to take a look at a couple of matches, maybe in another video. I don't really know how long this video is, but that is some of the reasons why I think that this deck could struggle a little bit. And again, it's remarkable that this was able to win big tournaments and dominate the top spots in big tournaments. But I think as the meta evolves, this deck may not prove to be one of the best decks of the format. Again, I might regret saying that because this deck might absolutely just be the best, but I don't know. I think, like I said, because the upgrades to this deck were so obvious and so easy to make, a lot of people probably gravitated towards this. It's kind of like what Ruby Amethyst was like at the beginning of Into the Inklands. Clearly not the best deck anymore, but because everybody was playing it in Rise of the Floodborn, who was competitive, it was so easy to just upgrade the deck, and the majority of players were probably still playing it. Whereas towards the end of the meta, where you saw the cards, become more readily available, Ruby Amethyst was basically non-existent because people realized there were just better decks in the format. So I think we might end up going in the same direction with this deck. Again, I could be completely wrong here, because once you do get the game plan established, and even if you don't get like the perfect curve, if you're at least able to survive long enough to eventually get your Fishbone Quill up and get your ink up there and get your Hiram going and being able to get your ink to a point where you can play multiple interactions in a turn, the deck is basically unstoppable at that point, right? If your hand is flush, the deck is just really, really strong. Another thing I will say too is, as we look at the meta right now, you've kind of seen a whole new world be phased out of the meta a little bit. Steel decks really aren't playing it. I mean, the only thing that really still plays it is Amber Steel Song, in my opinion, right now. And this deck was the deck that really benefited from all of the steel decks in the format, right? Playing a whole new world and stuff, because Ruby dominates steel and you just benefit so much off of a whole new world. So if that becomes less of a trend in the meta, this deck might fall behind as well. So again, these are just some initial impressions. The game, we've only had these Ursula's Returns cards for less than a week still, so there's still a lot to analyze, but that's just my take on Ruby Sapphire right now. It's still a very strong deck, don't get me wrong, but these are just some of the things you have to be aware of as you play this deck, and if you test it, you probably have experienced what I'm talking about, because I think most people do. So for me, like I said, if I play a deck, I just know I would always like to have options. I don't want to have a deck being played where if my opponent knows how to out my threats or out the key cards that I need in order for my deck to work, I'm kind of just sitting there dead in the water. I'm stuck with a bunch of uninkables in my hand. My opponent outs my Fishbone Quill. There was a match I played against like a set 3 Amethyst Steel deck, and the guy had 2 Benjas, and even though I had 2 Fishbone Quills, he outed both of them. And I was able to get 2 extra ink, but I couldn't get my Hiram off, so I ended up having to ink it, and I had like no cards in hand, and he was playing Amethyst, so he still was like drawing cards, and I'm like, wow. And I had a bunch of uninkables, so I'm just like, yeah, I'm just going to lose this matchup now because I don't even know what I could have done better there. Like, I play my Fishbone Quill, I ink with it. I had the Hiram to pop the Fishbone Quill next turn if I needed to draw the cards, but they outed it with the Benja. Then I played a second one. They outed that with the Benja, so I ended up having to ink the Hiram. I had no other inkables in hand, and I'm just sitting there dead in the water, and they're drawing cards. They have Benjas on field that are requesting for 2, and I'm just like, yep, I just lose when I should be winning against Steel. So again, I know it's not always going to be like that. Obviously it depends on how the interactions go. Does the opponent have the out? Do they not have the out? Maybe it was just how the matchup went. But it just feels really underwhelming that like I have my combo set up, and if my combo gets interrupted, I seemingly just lose the game. I don't know. Maybe you can let me know in the comment section below how you feel if I'm kind of blowing this out of proportion. But that's my take on the deck. Let's go ahead and either wrap up the video or go to gameplay. If this video is over 10 minutes, I'll probably do the gameplay video in a separate video. But if you've made it this far, thank you again for watching. And yeah, let's see what's up next.